Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the very sobering topic of euthanasia in our continuing study of biblical ethics. Euthanasia, it comes from two Greek words. Eu is the prefix just meaning good, and then thanatos is the word for death. And so the idea is that this might be a good death. And of course, if you have to die, I guess a good death sounds like a good thing, but people don't always die in a pleasant manner. And so euthanasia involves, now there can be several types. First of all, there's non-voluntary euthanasia where the patient is unable to indicate his informed consent. Can't really say what's going on. Maybe he or she is unconscious, or perhaps due to medication is just sort of out of it. But there can also be involuntary euthanasia. That takes place against the patient's will. Well, we call that murder. When somebody doesn't want to die and you put them to death. That's just sort of obvious. But there's also passive euthanasia, and that would be continuing or discontinuing life support. And so this is really the question. It's within this area of passive euthanasia. When we talk about the ethics of it, is it a proper thing? Euthanasia, notice this poster says, if you really care, you'll end it. And yet you can really care and perhaps see euthanasia as a wrong thing, depending on what type you're looking at and the circumstances. So we've been talking about abortion in the past versus euthanasia. With abortion, that's talking about putting a baby to death. With euthanasia, that's talking about putting usually an older person, although it's not necessarily confined to that. The rationale in each case, in the rationale of the abortion, you're saying, well, that child is I don't want it for whatever reason. Maybe it's because there's a deformity. Maybe because it's just inconvenient. Euthanasia, likewise, a person is being seen as a burden upon society. So it's time to just pull the plug and move them out of here. In the case of abortion, they're too young to consent. In euthanasia, they're too old to continue, and so the age becomes the rationale. Intelligence also becomes a rationale where, in the case of abortion, that child is not yet conscious or maybe self-conscious. In euthanasia, sometimes it's argued, well, they're no longer conscious, they're no longer able to, they're what's happened now is maybe there's no longer they've lost consciousness and maybe won't come back, or at least that's the thinking. I'm reminded of a friend of mine who went into a coma, and he was there for a good month, and they were talking about do we continue this? Do we pull the plug? And he came out of it and lived. He's still alive at this point. And he's still going strong, and he and his wife, they're doing quite well. He is ministering and sharing the gospel, and he had been a possible candidate for euthanasia because he was no longer conscious. The place of residence, notice, and in the case of abortion, it's in the womb. After that, you call it just murdering the child. That we talked last time about the afterbirth abortion, but that's just another word for murder. In the case of the elderly, they might be in a hospital or in a nursing home. The rationale regarding the meaningfulness of life, it says, well, he doesn't yet have life, and so therefore it's okay, and that argument is made toward abortion. Or with the case of the older person, they no longer have a meaningful life, and that's the argument that's made. Now, some arguments that have been put forth for assisted suicide. When I say this, I'm not advocating it, but I want to look at those arguments. It's claimed that patients have the right over their own bodies, and I would say, well, under normal circumstances, yes. But does that mean that it's okay to kill yourself? Socrates, for example, was faced with either banishment or suicide, and he chose the hemlock over leaving town. and so he chose suicide. Um, David Hume made the comment that no man ever threw away life while it was worth keeping, and so therefore it must not be worth keeping if this person wants to commit suicide. So it must be okay. Involved in this also is the right to refuse treatment. Now that's a bit different than assisted suicide. That's different than taking your life. This is taking your life. That's active. This is more of a passive thing, refusing treatment. And most ethics will say yes, it's okay to refuse additional treatment. In fact, the Patient Self-Determination Act in 1991 made this part of the law in the United States. The argument for shortening suffering, and of course we don't want people to suffer, and so therefore assisted suicide is seen as a way out of that suffering. And finally, a much more crass argument, but nevertheless real, is that continued medical expenses are seen as a drain on medical resources, especially these days when healthcare systems are becoming increasingly burdened. This is seen as an issue. Indeed, healthcare, because of the cost, it was noted in California that after certain laws had been passed that allowed for, or at least they were proposing assisted suicide, that the insurance companies were saying, well, we're not going to pay for your very expensive treatments, but if you want to engage in euthanasia, you want to hire a doctor to kill you, we'll pay for that. And so healthcare is a slippery slope to begin moving and stopping treatment that is considered too expensive, and yet allowing and encouraging people to engage in suicide, in euthanasia. Now, an alternative, and this is a good alternative, hospice care, where the focus is on the comfort of the individual. It's understood, yes, this person he's only expected to live maybe a maximum of 6 months, and so they focus on his comfort. Doesn't include life prolonging measures. They're not taking they're not trying to extend the person's life, but rather have them comfortable during these last 6 months. The prognosis is of 6 months or less, and they're trying to see to the comfort of the individual. The care is usually provided at home as opposed to the hospital, and it becomes a team effort of comfortable, family-oriented, if there's family there, death, and yet caring for both the individual and for the family, and that's a good thing. We have what has been called palliative care. That's care when you are seeking to extend a person's life, maybe make them comfortable, but extend their life, or maybe even help them to get better, as opposed to end-of-life care, which sees no, that person's not going to get better. We're trying to focus on how we're going to treat this person as they die. That is inevitable. And then hospice care is within that period of that last 6 months, or maybe shorter, in which we're trying to make that person comfortable as they're dying. There is no expected hope of recovery. It's not saying it never happens, but we're trying to allow that person to die with pain-free and surrounded by loved ones, and with a certain amount of dignity. Now, what does the Bible say? Genesis chapter 9, beginning in verse 5. We're going to look at this passage again when we come to capital punishment. But God says, surely I will require your lifeblood. From every beast I will require it. That is, if an animal kills a person, or from every man, from every man's brother, I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. Notice the reason this given is because man is made in the image of God. So you ought not to take that life lightly. It's of value because it has been made in the image of God, and that gives it value. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1 says there's an appointed time for everything, and there's a time for every event under heaven, and there's a whole list of things that follow, but the one we're going to look at is first on the list, a time to give birth and a time to die. That there is a time to die, and it comes this side of heaven to every person, at least until our Lord returns, and death will finally be defeated. But until that time, there is a time to die. Proverbs chapter 31, beginning in verse 4, there's advice being given to this person, O Lemuel. It's not for kings, O Lemuel. It's not for kings to drink wine, or for rulers to desire strong drink, for they will drink and forget what is decreed and pervert the rights of the afflicted. And so therefore, when you're in charge, you shouldn't be taking those sorts of foreign substances. But, notice verse 6, give strong drink to him who is perishing, and wine to him whose life is bitter. So this isn't necessarily the big idea, but notice in passing, the one who is perishing, yes, go ahead and give these things that will maybe dull the senses and dull the pain, and help them through to the end of that time. Now, there are some accounts of suicide that are found in the Bible, but they're not necessarily good accounts. These aren't saying, go and do this. For example, there's the story of Abimelech in Judges chapter 9, who is, he's sort of a rebel, do-it-yourself king, and he's doing some bad things, and he's besieging this tower, and a woman throws a millstone, and it hits him in the head, and he's mortally wounded, and he says to his armor bearer, quick, kill me, so that it won't be said that a woman killed me. Notice he's doing this for his own honor, and of course we always say anyway that a woman killed him, and she did. And that's the Abimelech story. Or there's the story of King Saul, likewise was wounded on the battlefield, and he's about to fall in the hands of the Philistines, and so he says to his armor bearer, quick, kill me. And his armor bearer doesn't want to do that. Now, later on, somebody lied about it, or maybe this is just telling the rest of the story in 2 Samuel. But in 1 Samuel, Saul falls on his own sword rather than let himself be taken alive. And of course, if they took him alive, he would stay alive long, but he wants to make it quick and relatively painless. And the Bible isn't endorsing that. In fact, it's not endorsing a lot of the things that Saul did toward the end of his life. There's a story of Ahithophel, who likewise he sets fire, and there's a building that's burning, and he burns with it. And very short story, you say, well, is that really suicide? Was that intentionally that he's killing himself? But it's not what I want you to see. It's not a good story. Zimri, I'm sorry, I was talking about Ahithophel earlier, who does go out and kill himself. Zimri is the one who sets fire to the building. My mistake. And the building comes down, and he dies. But neither of these are good stories. Job's wife. Remember, Job has been stricken with all sorts of what look like incurable boils, and she says to him, "Well, just curse God and die." And of course, that was bad advice on so many levels. But just from a pragmatic level, that's not going to be the end of Job's life. He's healed at the end. He's restored at the end. We don't read about his wife at the end. We don't know what happened to her. But that was bad advice. Judas Iscariot, after having betrayed his master Jesus, he goes out and he commits suicide. And he hangs himself. And now Acts tells a story about how he falls headlong. Maybe those two are connected, where he hangs himself and doesn't do a very good job, and then the body falls and bursts open. But it's, at least the way Matthew tells the story, that's a suicide account, and that's, again, not good. You're not supposed to be following Judas as your example. The final story is an averted suicide, and that's the Philippian jailer, who, remember in Acts chapter 16, Paul and Barnabas have been held in prison, and there's an earthquake, and the chains fall off, and he comes up, he wakes up and thinks, "Whoa, my goodness, my charges have escaped," and This will bring ruin and devastation not just upon me but upon my family unless I commit suicide. And so he's looking to do what he thinks is the honorable thing. And they stop him and they say, no, don't hurt yourself. They actually do suicide prevention there in Acts 16. Now, there's two types of euthanasia. There's active euthanasia, that just, and I believe that's contrary to the scriptures because it involves actively killing the individual, and that makes it murder. But there's also passive suicide, and we're going to see there's several types of that. Passive suicide might be circumstantially possible as it involves withdrawing life support, not actively killing the person, but stopping those things that are extending life. Now, under passive euthanasia, we want to be distinctive here too, because there could be the withdrawal of those natural means of sustaining life, like you take away a person's food or water or even air. Well, you normally would get food and water and air to sustain your life, and so that's starving somebody to death or smothering somebody or causing them to just taking away their water. That's cruel and unusual. On the other hand, withdrawal of artificial means of sustaining life, removal of mechanical or artificial means that might be required to keep one alive, that can be acceptable, because after all, these things weren't something that God naturally put into place. We've artificially been using those things. That doesn't mean that does not mean they're bad. For example, I have in my own chest, I have 2 stents that are keeping me alive. That's artificial, and I'm personally glad that they're there. I'm able to continue living and teaching and being with my family, and I wake up every morning and say thank you, Lord, for this gift from God, and I'm pleased at it. But to have something withdrawn isn't necessarily a bad thing. How do you make the decision to pull the plug? Geisler, on page 176, gives us these steps. The disease, he says, must be irreversible. I think this is just the voice of wisdom here. The patient must have veto power. That is, you don't do it against his will. Now, he might have given that affirmation early on, while he was still conscious, and while he was still viable, and that's perfectly a good thing. It must be a collective decision. And he cites, and I think this is good, Proverbs chapter 24, verse 6, where we read, "For it is by wise guidance that you will wage war, and in abundance of counselors there's victory." It's good to hear a second opinion or a third opinion, so that somebody might not be making a bad decision just because of the emotions of the moment. And I'm sure that you've heard of situations or know of situations where someone in great emotional turmoil perhaps took their own life, and that was not a good thing. But there can be a decision to disconnect and to pull the plug, and to let the Lord take that life. The good news is that's not the end of the story, because we believe in one who not only died but rose again, and he came back to say that there will be a day when we will also rise from the dead. Are you prepared for that? Have you encountered Jesus the Christ, and have you trusted in him for your eternal life?